Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here to talk a little bit about historical events that the anniversary of it just passed, and it was one of those. It's one of those events that we don't really hear about in American history in terms of global anti-Semitism. We hear a lot about anti-Semitism, and it's coming up Holocaust memorialism and about the victims of the Holocaust in World War II. But one thing we don't hear a lot about is this one. This one was like a precursor to World War II in what was then the Russian Empire. And this the Kishinev massacre, which took place in Kishinev, modern day city in Moldova in Eastern Europe. Um, the events that led up to this was an accusation by some of the locals. It was Easter time. We talked about Orthodox Easter and how the Orthodox countries in Eastern Europe, their Easter differs from that of the West. But on both East and West, an unfortunate consequence of Easter would sometimes be that after Easter services were over, people would be people would be reveled up with religious fer- with religious fervor and piety, and they would go out into the streets and attack the local Jewish population. Well, this is exactly what happens here, coupled with the accusation that a Ukrainian boy had been kidnapped and that the Ukrainian boy's blood was being used for Passover to make Passover matzah. This was the beginning of a blood libel. So here the people have this ultra religious fervor. They have this ultra religious zeal. They believe, according to their liturgy, that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ, and they cannot wait to unleash, fury upon the Jewish people. Plus, to avenge this boy. The name of the boy's name was. The boy's name was Remenchko. So they couldn't wait to do this. And unfortunately, and that wasn't the only thing. There were a lot of other things going on, particularly in the Ukraine and Moldova region at that time, that would lead a lot of resentment um, of them against the Jewish people. And one of them was that there was a lot of latifundias, big plantations, big farms, like Roman style farms that a lot of the peasants or the serfs in Eastern Europe were living on, and Jewish merchants were controlling these farms, you know, as a sort of middleman for the absentee Polish, Lithuanian, and Russian um, overlords. And this, of course, would lead to so much resentment from the peasantry of Eastern Europe. And also, Jewish individuals owned a lot of the bars and drinking establishments of Eastern Europe. And a lot of times they would overcharge some of the peasants. And of course, when it comes to peasants, especially for Eastern European peasants, um, they love to drink. So they filled up with religious fervor. They're filled up with anti-Semitism and financial resentment of the Jews, and they're trying to avenge this boy from the blood libel. Because again, blood libel is the belief that around the time of Passover, to make the Passover matzah, Jewish people go around and kill, one young Jewish boy and use his blood in the making of, one Christian boy rather, and use his blood in the in the making of matzah. So they're like, what the hell? It's like there's QAnon shit. You know how like we have QAnon people today that are buying into this global conspiracy of pedophilia, and they believe the QAnon people, just like these blood libel individuals, They believe that they are justified because, hey, they're harming a child, right? They're a chomo. They deserve to die. Well, it was this. It was the same thing with these people. They absolutely believed that the Jewish people were doing this to young Christian boys. They were kidnapping them in the middle of the night, using their blood to make matzah. So they could not wait till Easter time to come to get out of the churches and start attacking um, Jewish shops and Jewish businesses and Jewish homes and everything. Jewish farmland, but not really farmland because most of the Jewish population lived in urban centers. They didn't really live in, you know, rural areas. But still, it was like Kristallnacht, but an early version of Kristallnacht. Um, so they come out of the church that day. It was like April 19th, according to our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, April 19th, 1903. And they start attacking Jewish people, start killing them. And they killed up to like 52,000 people for like 5 days. And this made global news at the time. Even here in the United States, the New York Times wrote a piece about it. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, and it coined the phrase pogrom. The word pogrom that we still use today, that describes persecution of the Jewish people at any particular time and place, was coined on this day on Kishinev. The fallout and ramifications of this was that massive amounts of Jewish people finally figured out it is no longer it would no longer be wise and no longer be smart for them to remain in the Pale of Settlement in this part of the Russian Empire, in the western part of the Russian Empire, which comprised, you know, Poland, Ukraine, Moldova, Western Russia, because they were only allowed in this certain area, which was called the Pale of Settlement. They decide, they have their own media. They have Yiddish media. They have, their own newspapers, their own networks. They're really influential, most of them, right? But they decide it is no longer wise. It is no longer possible for them to remain in Eastern Europe. They must leave Eastern Europe. But where are they going to go? In 1897, that was when the first Zionist conference in Basel, Switzerland happened with Theodor Herzl. Of course, Theodor Herzl, because of the Dreyfus affair, in which a French Jewish officer was stripped of um, his military regalia, his military um, position, just for being Jewish, in the most integrated society in European history, the place where Napoleon in the 1800s emancipated the Jews out of the ghetto. And if even in that place in 1897, a Jewish man could not get any respect, Theodor Herzl surmised that a Jewish man could not get any respect anywhere in Europe, and that a Jewish state in Palestine was necessary. So, but again, most Jewish people were living fine in other parts of the world. Maybe not as, economically well off in the Pale of Settlement, but they were doing fine in Germany. They were doing fine in parts of the United States, parts of Canada, parts of South Africa. So nobody was really on board to on board to with the Zionist project really all that much, except for like religious people that wanted to go to Jerusalem to wait the coming of the Messiah. Nobody else. But after this, after Krishnev, now they're starting to see Theodore Herzl's point. Now more people are starting to read Oid Nuland, his book about the founding of the state of Israel, and they're starting to see, maybe he has a point. that there is no point of us trying to integrate into Gentile society because the Gentiles are never going to accept us. They're always going to look at us as second class. They take, for example, the Spanish Inquisition, right? The Spanish Inquisition, the Jewish people there converted to Christianity, but still there was no trust amongst um, the Christian authorities and the new Christian Jewish conversos. They still persecuted them and they still expelled them in 1492. So it was surmised by them looking throughout all of history. When you look at um, the Rhineland massacres in the 1096, as the Crusaders were going to the Holy Land, they said, "Okay, we don't have to wait till we get to the Holy Land to kill Muslims. We can kill Jews in the Rhineland in this part of Germany on the way there." You know what I mean? So people like Theodore Herzl and people like Zeb Jabotinsky, they looked at history as a whole, as a totality, and they said, they came in, they surmised, listen, sticking around here in not just Eastern Europe, but even Western Europe, where it's more liberal, and Jewish people have freedoms, and ghettos were disbanded. Even there, Jews were still not respected. Jews were still not. Jewish property was still not safe. Jewish life was still not safe. And this Kishinev massacre was proof that he was right. That Herzl was right. That they have to leave Eastern Europe and go to Israel and make their own state, because only in their own state would they then be secure. So because of this inspires what they call the first yeshuv, the first mass settlement of Jewish people in Palestine. Most of them coming from Poland and stuff, and they're the ones that really found the earliest, the second earliest settlements. There was a previous settlement that established like Tel Aviv and stuff, but this group, the ones coming from the Kishinev um, refugees from the Kishinev massacre, they're the ones that really lay the foundation. Most of them are leftist. Most of them are socialist. The beginnings of Israeli politics begin in leftism and socialism, but it was this group that really laid the foundation. I think Ben Gurion was involved with this group. Zeb Jabotinsky, of course, the founder of Israeli conservatism, was involved with this group. Um, so many of them were involved with this particular incident escaping Eastern Europe. And this, of course, leads to an imbalance where they're going to, because where they're going to, Ottomans, and we've talked about this before, Ottomans in their realm, they don't really have a problem with Jewish people settling there. Of course, after the expulsion from Spain, the Ottomans welcomed in Jews that were expelled from Spain from Spain and Portugal to their Ottoman realms. Sephardic culture, Ladino culture survived in places like Thessaloniki in Greece, or in Bulgaria, or in other places, and even in Safed, a part of northern Israel. Kabbalic learning, you know, from Sephardic teachers like Moses de Leon survived as well. You know what I mean? Because Jews went back to Israel, and during the Ottoman Empire, they settled there. Sephardic Jews from Portugal and Spain. But now, after the Kishinev massacre, now you have Jewish people from the Russian Empire coming in, Ashkenazim, and Ashkenazim had started coming in the early 1800s. Again, starting little yeshivas here and little yeshivas there, and I believe Rehovot was already founded by then. It was a settlement started by the Rothschilds, a rich Austrian Jewish family that are often linked to various conspiracy theories and stuff. But Rehovot was already founded. Petah Tikva, I believe, was already founded by then, which was called the mother of all settlements. Which, if you wanted to compare American settlements to Israelis, American history to Israeli history, Petah Tikva would be like Virginia. you know, you know what I mean? Be like the mother of all settlements. I believe that was already founded by then. Tel Aviv was not. Tel Aviv was founded in 1909. So this wave of Jews coming in from Kishinev was the ones that really founded, you know, like I said, the early institutions that would become the state of Israel. But where else did they go? Another place they went was here, the United States. Because of this, again, Jews felt like they could not live in Eastern Europe anymore. They felt like they were unwelcomed in Eastern Europe anymore. This massacre was so horrific against the Jewish population that they felt they couldn't stay there. So some of them could not get into Israel because Israel was still at that time under the Ottomans, and of course the Ottomans were Muslim, and they didn't want to see an upset of the ethnic balance between Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in the area. And also add to that, these Jewish people were coming from the Russian Empire, and as we discussed in the Orthodox Easter slash Druze holiday video, the Ottoman Empire was an enemy to the Russian Empire. They were positioned as adversaries, with Russia representing Eastern Orthodox Christianity and the Ottomans representing Islam. So letting a bunch of these Muscovites, as they were called, or Russian members of the citizens of the Russian Empire into Palestine from the perspective of the Ottoman sultans wouldn't be that smart. So immigration to Palestine was limited. You know what I mean? It happened. It happened more this time than it did, you know, leading up to the Holocaust, because politics were different, and the British were trying to negotiate a greater, you know, a greater agreement with local Arab politicians. So at this time, the Arabs, still viewed themselves mostly as Muslims, and as Muslims first. They put their religion first, so they saw themselves as allies with the Turks. It wasn't the Arab nationalism didn't begin to ferment like it would in the months and years leading up to World War One, that eventually caused the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. That hadn't happened yet. So Zionism was first. Jewish nationalism, Jewish desire to create a homeland in that area was first, before the Arab desire was. But they still weren't going to let a lot of Jewish people in. So United States was another place, another destination that they could go, and many did go. Many did go. Many went. Just like um, other times when those Cossacks would attack Jewish people, they would attack Jewish villages. Where would Jewish people often end up? In places like New York, places like Chicago. Now, there was already an established Jewish community in New York and in Chicago, but most of them were educated Germans, right? They spoke the German language. They didn't speak the ghettoized Yiddish language. They looked at Yiddish as a ghetto language, as a low class language. And they looked at these heavily more religious people coming from the shtetls of Eastern Europe as the drudge of Jewish society. And there was some tension, just as there was tension when the German Jews first arrived and the Sephardic Jews from, they originally came from Recife, northern Brazil. But after the Dutch lost control of Brazil, the Portuguese came back in and they reinstituted the Inquisition. Those those Portuguese, Brazilian, Dutch Jews had to go elsewhere, and most of them settled in New York or Rhode Island. And then later on, in the latter half of the 1800s, the German Jews came in, and the German Jews established, a name for themselves, a stake for themselves. But by this time, the early 1900s, it was the time of the Eastern European Jews, and it was the Eastern European Jews that really that really set the tone for what we think of in American society and even in Western society as Jewish culture. Matzo ball soup, klezmer music, right? Fiddler on the Roof. In fact, Fiddler on the Roof was a loose adaptation written by Shlomo Melech um, of what happened here. He changes the location from Moldova to Anatevka, Ukraine, but it was basically the same thing, right? Talking about this program and all the stuff we associate with modern uh, modern Judaism, like what Ben Shapiro calls cultural Judaism, is stuff that comes from the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to America during this time, right? The early 1900s, the Kishinev massacre. And it's this time that Eastern European Jews established their dominance in northern cities, particularly New York. They bring with them bagels, they bring with them lox, they bring with them klezmer music, Eastern European klezmer music. They bring with them everything, all the Yiddishisms that every New Yorker pretty much knows, right? Every New Yorker knows what is a schmuck. Every New Yorker knows what is Ive. Every New Yorker knows what is verklempt. Things that you'll see in popular media in the United States here, like on the show The Goldbergs, calling somebody Bubby, right? The grandmother, Bubby. All that stuff is from this migration of this group of Jewish people out of Eastern Europe to the United States. You know what I mean? So this is very important. Even organized crime. We talk a lot about organized crime and different races impacted by it on this channel, American Me video, some videos on called by Costa Nostra. But even during that, even about that, is a movie called Once Upon a Time in America, starring Robert De Niro and James Woods, about the migration of Jewish people to the Lower East Side in New York City. And it was during this period that they show the formation of what will become with the Kosher Nostra, the Jewish um, mafia, the Jewish hand of organized crime, which Meyer Lansky, Arnold Rothstein, uh, Bugsy Siegel all play a role in. And they might not be members of La Cosa Nostra because, of course, you had to be Sicilian and involved with the initiation, the omerta, is certain Catholic rites, like burning the saint or whatever. But these Jewish guys were associates of the mafia, and they built up their own mafia. This was during the time of an individual by the name of Monk Eastman. Already, gangs and stuff had been established in the Five Points, the lower half of Manhattan, by the Irish when the Irish had come over as a result of the potato famine in the 1840s. Now the Italians are coming over as a result of the unification of Italy and Giuseppe Garibaldi. And as a result of this Kishinev massacre, the Jewish people are coming over. And they are establishing their claim in the same territory that the Irish and the Italians once established their claim. So they're doing the exact same thing, and they are starting to become very powerful as well, especially in the Lower East Side. Lower East Side becomes the hub of Jewish culture, Yiddishkeit, Jewish culture in New York City. And eventually, of course, Jewish people will rise to great prominence, especially in the field of social work. It is often said by some individuals, Umar Johnson, the black nationalist in particular, he says that Italians Italians took the fire department, the Irish took the police department, and the Jewish community took the social services. And that is pretty much true because a lot of Jewish women became public school teachers and had a lot of influence in the New York City public school system because of this wave of migration. But of course, not every Jewish person left. There were Jewish people that was still remaining in Eastern Europe, and unfortunately, we know the history of that. We know that um, what happened, with the Holocaust and stuff in the 30s, in the 1930s. But the Holocaust didn't exist. My point is to make this video is that the Holocaust didn't exist in a vacuum. You know what I mean? It was centuries and centuries of Jewish persecution in Europe, centuries and centuries going back to like the 1090s of Jewish massacres in Europe, everywhere in Europe, everywhere. Every time there was an Easter, whether it was Orthodox Easter or Western Easter, and something would happen, it would be riot after riot. It was very similar to what we experienced here in the United States when it came to African Americans. Every time there was an alleged um, rape of a white woman in this country, or an alleged uh, crime done against particularly a white woman, but also a white guy, there was burning downs of whole communities like Ocoee, Florida, or Wilmington, South Carolina, or most famously in the 1920s, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So this is what went on in Eastern Europe. But out of this, I always find the story of Jewish history to be really unique because, like, you'll have something in Jewish history that will be totally messed up. Like, it can be even like their holidays, right? Every holiday, and Paul Heyman, the manager in WCW, made this joke. You know, every holiday is a celebration of we're the Jewish people. There was anti-Semitism against us. Somebody tried to wipe us out but failed. But each time they tried to wipe us out, we become more powerful and more successful each time they try to knock us down. So whether you're talking about Esther, saving the Jewish people from Haman, right? Um, and the Persians, or you're talking about the Maccabees defeating the Seleucids, right? Or you're talking about the Holocaust. You're talking about the 6 Day War. You're talking about Kishinev. Or you're talking about how Jewish people suffered under the Crusades, or how they suffered in Yemen, or how they suffered in Ethiopia, or how they suffered in even with the formation of early Islam in the 7th century when Muhammad wiped out two whole tribes of Jewish people living in Saudi Arabia, the Benu Qurayza and the Benu Qurayza and Benu Kainuka. Even that, right? Even persecution they experienced in Germany, persecution they experienced in Spain, persecutions they've experienced, even a national tragedy like Yitzhak Rabin getting murdered, right? Or something like that happening, or the Yom Kippur War in 1973. All of these events throughout history that, you thought, okay, yes, the Jewish people are down and out now. This is the end of them, right? Babylonian exile, yeah, they're in Babylon for 70 years, but they come back and they're even stronger thanks to Cyrus the Great, right? They come back and their second temple is even not as grand, but almost just as grand and just as in a big attraction throughout the whole Middle East as the first temple of Solomon was. You know what I mean? They lose their kingdom of the Hasmoneans thanks to the Romans. They come in, they have some problems with the Romans. You have Masada, you have Jesus come in, you know. And yeah, the temple gets destroyed in 70 AD, but Judaism gets reinvented from biblical Judaism, from temple based Judaism to rabbinical Judaism. Then you have them wandering around again, just like they were wandering around in the time of Abraham, right? The Heberu, the Egyptians called them. Now they're wandering around again from country to country and going through all these persecutions, but they reemerge once again and they become an economic superpower in each and every society and pretty much where they lived, you know? Then they come to the United States, right? And then in the United States, because of this wave from Eastern Europe over these preceding decades, they began to found Hollywood. They began to found our cultural institutions. They began to give us the, the you know, their flavor, their aspects of their culture that we wouldn't have, aspects of our culture that we wouldn't have were not for their culture, such as the comedy of Jerry Seinfeld and pretty much all comedy. Um, Groucho Marx is a famous example, right? George Burns, pretty much, and politics too. Both the right and the left is heavily influenced today in modern society by Jewish intellectuals. So the fact that the Jews can be beaten down and never defeated, they always reemerge more popular. Okay, Egyptian slavery happens, they come out of it as a people. Holocaust happens, they come out of it as a nation. Um, Spanish Inquisition, pogroms, Kishinev pogroms, that leads to the foundation of the early settlements in Israel and their migration to the United States. So um, it's just amazing, man. When I look at the totality of, when I look at the totality of Jewish historical achievements and the fact that they've suffered so much persecution for over 2,000 years and they're still around today, not to mention rightly or wrongly the role they played in the mainstream civil rights movement too, in acquiring rights for African Americans here in this country, which African Americans in this country kind of played a similar role to um, the Jewish people in Eastern Europe, kind of like an analogous role. I mean, Jewish people in Eastern Europe and Europe in general were never chattel slaves. Okay, there was chattel slavery in the Bible, right, with the Egyptians, but in the European context, and anything we can prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, um, you know, not such a thing did not exist, right? But they were economically disadvantaged. They were played against the poorer classes, and it was oftentimes the poorer classes and those people that were economically deprived, like the Cossacks, um, in Eastern Europe, that railed against them. Like I said, the workers on the Lundifundia, the plantation, the serfs that would rather rail against them because and the Cossacks. Cossacks were basically an elite army group of peasants in Eastern Europe, designed to drive off Central Asian invaders like the Tartars and later the Ottomans. But when they got done doing that, when they got done defending the Kievan Rus and and later the Russian Empire from outsiders like the Polish or the Kalmyks, or the Kalmyks, another name for the Tartars, or the Ottomans, they went to the Jews because they were the disadvantaged of society. So um, the upper classes scapegoated the Jews. They used us Jews as scapegoats. They used the Jews as like, oh, don't blame us. Don't blame the kings and queens that are taking advantage of you and taking your land and making you into serfs. Blame the middleman Jews. And that was similar to here in the United States. Here in the United States, Jayhawks, you know, outlaw Confederate people after the Civil War. And of course, the Ku Klux Klan, as we know, during Reconstruction, they were bitter. They were bitter about having their land being taken away by the government, as they saw as an encroachment, the war of northern aggression against them. So they didn't, the governments there, the southern governments, the southern aristocrats, and even the northern ones, didn't take, they didn't take responsibility for it. They freaking, they uh, they said just blame the black people. So the black people were often scapegoated as the problem. And of course, black people in this country were otherized, just as Jewish people in European societies were otherized. Catholics in Britain were often otherized. Okay, yes, there's a problem in the world. There's a problem with society. The peasants have a problem. You take some of the heat off the government. What I'm going to do is blame it on this other group. I'm going to blame it. I'm going to blame it on the Jews. I'm going to blame it on the Catholics. I'm going to blame it on the black. So that's how I see it. Their situation was kind of analogous. The only difference again is chattel slavery and the fact that Jewish people were able to maintain their culture to a large degree and carry their culture portably everywhere they went. And their culture was the glue, the adhesive that kept them together over the centuries in the diaspora. You know, while they were removed from Israel for 2,000 years, what kept them together was their culture. African Americans who were subject to chattel slavery didn't have that luxury. They had to build up the culture from scratch and whatever was given to them. You know what I mean? So that was different. But anyway, yeah, the Kishinev massacre, a totally horrible massacre. The reverberations are kind of still being felt today because of that we have the Israeli-Arab conflict in the Middle East right now. So that's how I connect the dots. Anyway, peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button. See when my next video is coming out. Love y'all. Yeah.